Hey, this is going to be another PAX Tube reaction video. It's been a little while since I made a video reacting to PAX Tube. I'm doing this for my new apartment during the day, and the lighting here is kind of tricky. I hope it looks okay. Because see, like, as you can kind of tell from behind me, I have some of these high windows that like stream in a lot of light from above, which is generally nice, but for making videos, it's kind of a problem. So I don't really know which lights to keep on or off right now. And this is the first video I've done here during the daytime as well. I'm off, of course, for the 4th of July. Here in the United States, it's a holiday. So I don't have work today. And I noticed this video was actually just posted like a few hours ago by PaxTube, and I just woken up because I'm sleeping in and all that. It was kind of interesting though. And when I saw the title, I immediately was a little surprised because that did not seem like a position PaxTube would take up, which is of course why America should not have been in World War I. And I posted the link to that video below. And this is one of the very few videos he's made that I actually agree with him on. And it's not just a thing that's completely just some random topic either. I mean, it's a little bit random. It's not like World War I is a thing I think about day in and day out and whether or not America should have been in it. But I've always kind of had the opinion that I didn't think America should be involved in World War I, which has sometimes got me from some flack from some other people. Like, I remember years ago during the Wonder Woman movie when it first came out, of course, that movie is centered on World War I and Wonder Woman is in it. And at one point, Chris Pine makes the quote when he's talking to Wonder Woman. He's like, you know, this war, it's all just one big mess. And to be honest, when I look at how World War I started and how it ended, that's kind of generally my opinion on it. It was one big mess. I mean, unlike World War II, which clearly there was very, very defined reasons why we had to go to war with Hitler and Japan, World War I was a lot more murky. I would say the United States, Britain, and the Allied powers were evil, triple entente, or however you pronounce it, as they call it, or that Germany was pure good. But it's often portrayed a little bit too much from the bias of us being the good guys and them being the bad guys, because there was a lot of things going on in that war that were mixed. And also Russia, of course, they had involvement in it. I don't really know that the Russians' involvement in it was totally good either. So anyways, I'm going to be reacting to his video on that. I'll, as usual, start off with my agreements here as well as then go into my disagreements. My agreements with him on this are pretty broad though. The main theme he mostly puts in it, and he talks about throughout it, is that a lot of the things that Germany was doing were just acts of war, like the unrestricted U-boat warfare, and that they were essentially, well, let me put it this way, that Germany was just acting no differently than the Allied powers. And again, that's something I agree with. I mean, Germany was not innocent by any means. Unrestricted U-boat warfare often targeted innocent civilian ships, like the sinking of the Lusitania. But he made one very good point in it, which is the thing that's often ignored by pro-US people, pro-US historians. The United States was supplying Great Britain not just with food, but with military armaments. That is borderline an act of war, kind of like we're doing right now in Ukraine, which is, by the way, another reason I'm making this video, because it pertains to topics going on these days, like with whether or not the US should get involved with what's going on in Ukraine, and whether or not we should get involved with Taiwan and China, were anything to ever happen there. Because, World War I, there was definitely a scenario in which the US would not have gotten involved in that war and everything would have been fine. I think the Allies still would have won, but honestly, it would have probably still just resulted in a peace treaty, some kind of truce eventually. And it maybe would have been more favorable to Germany. And which of course brings me to the biggest topic of this video, which is, what effect, one point that that PaxTube makes that's pretty good, and that is, that U.S. involvement led to an even worse peace treaty for Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, in even worse terms, which crippled Germany so badly that it led to the rise of Hitler, Nazis, and World War II. And that's actually a very interesting point he brought up. I think he's getting it from maybe someone else that he maybe read in a book or something. but he never quoted it directly. But that's an incredibly good point, and something that we already know has a lot of historical precedent in it that actually is very easy to back up. For one, that's absolutely true. It's almost universally accepted that the Treaty of Versailles is what in part led to the rise of nationalism and Nazism in Germany. I mean, not that that justifies what Hitler was doing, but it absolutely left Germany in a crippled and embittered state that most people who had any common sense, even at the time the treaty was being signed, such as John Maynard Keynes, Woodrow Wilson, some of the top generals, all said this is just a temporary truce to the next fire until the next war. So that's actually a very good point. And one thing is for certain, with the United States not in it, the Allies would have had a much less favorable position for bargaining, and it may have been a more fair treaty. So that's a very good point. That was one thing why even I think I ended up deciding to make this video. And one thing I like too is that he included footage from the Canadian miniseries Hitler: Rise of Evil that was like way back in the early 2000s. But I saw it back when it was live when I was in like the 6th grade. And I've watched it many times now on like YouTube and Amazon Prime. And I know that's a little bit weird because it's about Hitler. But the thing is it shows the circumstances of Germany during World War I, after World War I, and all up until Hitler actually finally consolidates absolute power in Germany. And it shows the circumstances in which a normally, educated, reasonable nation of people became under the boot of the Nazis and under the control of a madman, and how that happened. And if you're worried that if it glorifies Hitler too much, trust me, if anything, the opposite. I mean, in typical Canadian fashion, it tries so hard to not be offensive that it almost makes itself just a little bit cliche at times. Like one scene where Hitler beats his dog when he's a soldier on the front of World War II. No, that wouldn't have happened. And Hitler loved animals. He was evil, but he loved animals. He wouldn't have beaten his dog, There was a bunch of other scenes like that were just goofy, random things put in that, were meant to try to make sure that they weren't glorifying Hitler, that were not historically accurate, though. But I'm not going to go into that. We're getting on a tangent. Where I'm going with this, back to PAX 2, is that he actually was mostly right on that. I mean, a lot of things that America was doing on that were borderline acts of war, and already in terms of what we were doing to help Britain. And the British and the French were not entirely pure on this. Remember, it was all over territory disputes primarily. And Britain primarily was getting into this to mostly keep Germany from being a competing power with it in Europe and across the world, as Britain viewed Germany as its primary competitor at that time. And it may have led to some good things. There were good consequences of World War I. A lot of modern countries were formed from it. And the wake of, parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that were split up, and some other things that happened at the end of World War I. However, that was not necessarily the intent. The British were mostly just doing it to weaken Germany, as were the French. They did not give up parts of their empire. In fact, their empires were swollen to the point that they really couldn't fully maintain them anymore. In most ways, World War I was not a positive occurrence. And the U.S. involvement in it, well, that is very hard to sometimes pin down because there were reasons, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmermann Note. The Germans were already somewhat of a, under the Kaiser and under the very unique structure they had, which was not what we would call a modern democracy by any means. I mean, there was a lot of reasons why the United States was not super friendly towards Germany. But honestly, I've always believed that World War I involvement, which cost, of course, I believe it was 110,000 U.S. soldiers' lives, was probably not necessary and not a positive thing. Again, that does not mean the U.S. soldiers were evil by any means. That does not mean all the politicians even were evil at the time. I think it was an event that you'd almost have to be there to say for certain whether or not it was a good move, because I was definitely not around back then. And of course, making this movie on the 4th of July, I don't want this to be a bashing the troops video. I'm bashing America, but sometimes, as I've made the point in other videos I think I made about American interventionism, militaries are not evil. American soldiers and other soldiers across the countries aren't evil. Some of them are heroes. They die for their country. but sometimes we have to be careful with remembering that the act of war and the institution of war is, on the whole, mostly an overused and very, very terrible thing. Okay, that it's a weird contradiction that's sometimes very hard to make sense of because I don't know. It's like for instance, working in finance. You know, that's what I work in. I work in banking, finance, or just I don't know, general business, whatever you want to call it. Finance sometimes implies like Wall Street or whatever. Trust me, I'm nowhere near that. I mean, it is a very necessary thing for the world. Capitalism, free market trade, certain things like that, banking. It is on the whole a necessity in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean every person doing it is necessarily wonderful and good. I mean, most people I've met in banking are just kind of in the middle, and some people really kind of suck. And I don't know. And what this may sound weird, but where I'm just going with this is that it's not as widely contrasting as the dynamic you encounter with, like, say, the military and war. I believe on the whole, the average person you'll meet in the military is better than the average person you'll meet in day-to-day life. They typically have to meet higher standards to get into certain sects, at least of the military. Like when my brother joined certain brigades that he had to join, there was a lot of different requirements he had to meet to get into it. They're held to a higher standard than the average person is, and on the whole, of course, they have to fight in some of the worst circumstances at times, that occur in the world. So it's a weird dynamic because but that doesn't mean necessarily the war itself is a good thing, or that the U.S. is always the good guy in the wars, or that other countries are always the bad guys, because their soldiers aren't evil monsters by any means. Even the German soldiers fighting under Hitler in World War II, serving the most evil leader of all time, they were not themselves evil. They were just paying the price for their evil leader's ambitions. But anyways, kind of going back again now I keep kind of going off on big tangents, but it's all kind of going back to the video that PAX 2 made about World War I. He also points to certain things in it, like he points to, now one thing I don't know I'm entirely certain on about how it led to the rise of communism, the U.S. involvement. I don't really agree with that. I don't think it would have affected it one way or the other. The reason that happened is that after the Russians lost World War I, there was going to be a revolution there one way or the other. Now, I don't know for certain how the U.S. involvement in World War I did or did not affect that, but the old Tsarist regime was out one way or the other, so that I think he was wrong on that point. There were some other disagreements that I had with him as well on it. He portrayed it maybe just a little too black and white the other way, which portrayed Germany as the good guys and the U.S. and the Allies and Triple Ententes, Great Britain, France, Russia as the bad guys. He tends to do that a lot in his videos. He makes everything infused with his opinion and overly black and white. And he does it. This video is not a huge exception. I did like, though, that he managed to, this was by far the most reasonable video I've ever seen him make. I don't mean this as to be a scathing criticism. I would just say that I think he had a little bit too much of that tone in the video, but it wasn't anything too bad. And another point I have to slightly disagree with him on. I think that the way he portrays the U.S. as, I don't know, he talks about how this is what led to American interventionism on the global stage afterwards, World War I, and the U.S. as a world power. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. I think there were some other points at which you could say that America became much more of the global policeman. But again, it's not really a huge disagreement. It's just, as usual, PAX 2, he goes a little too far in his videos when he has a good point, and he tries to make a mountain out of it, infusing his bias in sometimes. But in this video, he did that much, much less badly than he usually does in his videos. So on the whole, this was a video I actually agreed with him a lot on. And it's an interesting point because it ties into American interventionism in a time in which it's very becoming an increasingly controversial topic here in the U.S. and abroad. Because, there could be potentially the defining event of the geopolitical event of our generation coming up with if China ever did invade Taiwan. And that would be an incredibly big event if the United States did actually go to war with China on that. Or if we didn't go to war, there still could be implications. So it's it's going to be a topic that matters going forward, discussing it in the United States and abroad. And of course, on another hand, like I said, we did not get involved with the Ukraine conflict, which is something I'm immensely happy about. Because as you can tell right now, I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. While Putin is definitely the bad guy, I mean, it's been, what, 2.5 years, and they're still fighting over just small spats of territory. The Ukrainians don't seem really in a huge hurry to make a peace treaty themselves, or by the Ukrainians, I mean their leaders, not every single Ukrainian citizen. And of course, Putin's doing what Putin does best or worse. He's not just looking to grab up some territory, So this is why I'm not a fan of intervention in some foreign affairs, because sometimes they get very sordid, and very often it's not just pure good versus pure evil, and sometimes you can even make the situation worse when you get involved. Can be argued the U.S. has been happened like in Afghanistan now with Taliban taking back over 20 years later. Or Iraq, some of the things that happened after we initially took over Iraq. Both of these events had positives with the U.S. involvement, but they certainly had some negatives, both for the U.S. and those countries. And, so that's why I find this an interesting video to comment on, and it's one that's very relevant. And, okay, this is a little bit random, but one last thing he input in the video that I want to end on that was an interesting thing he mentioned in the video. This is, again, a little random, I apologize. He mentioned a quote by Robert E. Lee, which was a quote about why the United States should not be kept as one, entire empire of all the states. And of course, he was making the case for the South withdrawing from the U.S. And he said something about how the United States, if it is allowed to remain an entire entity, will become an aggressor on the global stage and a tyrant and despot to those at home. Now, I don't know that I entirely agree with that quote, okay? And I'm going to be careful about putting Robert E. Lee on too much of a pedestal, because obviously the Confederacy was definitely in the wrong. They supported things that were horrible, including slavery, but also the Confederacy on the whole, if you just look at the way they were devised, was not a good organization at all. But sometimes I've even occasionally wondered if war was the right solution in the case of the Civil War. Eventually slavery would have gone away, even in the South. It was becoming a globally criticized thing. A lot of countries would not have done business with the South as long as they continued with slavery. A lot of European countries would not have done business with them. The North certainly would have had a lot of hostility towards them. And sometimes I look at that and wonder if the Civil War, was absolutely the right course of action. Now, I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm not certain that it was wrong, but this is just to give you a little bit of an idea overall on my perspective, since this is just about why I believe aggression is generally not a positive thing on the world stage, even when it's maybe done in the name of a good cause. In this case, the cause couldn't have been much better, and we did have tremendously positive outcomes, obviously, abolishing slavery. But it also established the precedent that a state cannot leave the United States out of their own free accord, meaning that we're not necessarily all in this just because we want to be in this. We're in this because, there's a big military that could suppress us if we do try to back out of it here in the United States. And that, on the whole, is not a good precedent. And again, if you say that about the American Civil War, some people will think you're trying to support the Confederacy. I'm not. Okay. It's more of just a general criticism of maybe, I guess you could say, imperialism and the idea of trying to force other countries to think the same way that you do, even if you might be right. Again, look at how that played out in Afghanistan, and look at how it played out in Iraq. And also to make a comparison though to another thing similar to this, and I'm just about done with this video, but this is just kind of a big rant I want to go on. Okay, think about, if you want to make a comparison where it actually did work, like in Japan and Germany, where the United States is to this day occupying those countries after we won in World War II. Japan and Germany, first off, we didn't have much of a choice. We were dragged into those wars, kicking and screaming, And for the most part, though, we weren't necessarily, really all the U.S. wanted to do, especially in the case of Germany, we just wanted to get Nazism out of Germany. After that, a lot of the countries started leaving Germany more to themselves, at least the Allied countries, not necessarily the Soviets. and it was more just trying to root out things that were especially dangerous to U.S. interests, as well as just things that could lead to another world war. It wasn't so much about trying to remake Germany into the United States. And the same with Japan, I think. Also we were trying to prevent communism from coming into Japan, which was another reason we kind of were very emphatic on trying to keep American ways of thinking in Japan. But we were also trying to keep Japan from becoming a nation the same that they'd been prior to that. A nation building extremely aggressive empire. But it was just much more limited in its objectives, is what I'm saying. It wasn't so much born out of the arrogance that we're going to fix these countries and make them like us. It was more born out of the idea, well, we had to go to this big ugly war, we had to win it, so we may as well now do what we can to kind of to heal the wounds and make these countries, and get rid of things that we literally know are not right within these countries, which they probably know, a lot of their citizens in the country know are not right, like a lot of Germans who hated Nazism, but we just have to now ensure that what led to this war won't happen again. And I don't know, that's probably just the best way of putting it, is be a little more humble and a little bit more limited in the objectives that we try to put on these, on the countries that we end up taking over. And also, let's not forget, the US was not the aggressor in World War II, neither was the Soviet Union, but they were the big winners of World War II. The countries that were the most aggressive, Germany, Japan, and let's not forget France and Britain. France and Britain were the ones that initially attacked Germany. They all came out on the losing end of World War II. And generally, a lot of times in history, you'll find the aggressors don't benefit as much as they think they do in the long run of things. It's generally why I am not a big fan of not just American interventionism, but just in general, I'm highly critical of being any country that's extremely aggressive in the modern world. So I don't know. I think that's about enough ranting for now. Weird video, a little bit strange to make on the 4th of July, but like I said, Pax2 made his video first a few hours ago, and I actually agreed with it. And like I said, this is not to bash soldiers or militaries on the whole. On the whole, militaries are a necessity and have been and will continue to be for a while in this world. As long as human beings have to violently settle disputes between them, and soldiers have to pay the price for those disputes oftentimes. So I don't believe that militaries or soldiers are evil, but like I said, I do believe the act of war, while I wouldn't say it's purely evil, it is hugely overused, and it probably is something that we want to downsize on the whole in the world. And hopefully that's something that me and Pax2 actually agree on from watching his video. So as usual, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.